The appalling conditions that the average soldier experienced during the First World War are almost impossible for 21st century society to appreciate. Mud, filth, lice, death, disease, and macabre landscapes were the grotesque realities of the front line, making everyday life at times simply unbearable. On top of this, massed infantry attacks, trench raids, and incessant artillery barrages, what the German officer Ernst Junger referred to as drum fire, strained the nerves of men to the breaking point, as soldiers waged a daily battle against the industrially produced material of modern warfare.
Now, because of the types of weapons and the tactics, the trench warfare and whatnot that you had here, you were going to suffer casualties no matter what. And so you did have meat grinders of battles that, even though they were more effective with the men that they had, it still presented high losses of casualties. There was no way to avoid that, I don't believe.
I think, there's probably all soldiers who served on the Western Front, infantrymen, probably had the same basic experience, having to deal with just filth and rot and artillery and gas and rats, and I think everybody had that in common.
The idea of moral courage lends an insight into how it was possible to endure the muddy hell of the front lines. But nevertheless, there was a limit to what men could endure. And for the French, when the communal reservoir of moral courage ran dry, the outcome would be a tidal wave of overt discontent. The British Army was quick to realize that if men were kept in the front lines for too long, they rapidly became ineffective, and accordingly, their men were regularly rotated in and out of the trenches. But it was not the same in the French Army, where in general, conditions were worse than they were for the British. In 1917, after 3 years of total war, something snapped amongst the poilus, stationed on the Chemin des Dames sector of the Western Front.
The thing that's really different about the French soldier, though, is that he was fighting on his soil. He didn't want to get comfortable. The Germans were building all these incredible defensive structures. The British were really, really building incredible trenches for comfort, for hygiene. The French really did not believe so much in that until later on. The idea being, why should we be so comfortable if the enemy's still on our ground? So if you were to compare your common French trench, it would look like a shambles compared to your average German trench. But as far as his experience in the trenches, it'd probably be very similar to most other soldiers.
The weather that April was particularly inclement, with rain and snow turning the battlefield into the typical quagmire of mud, men, and materiel so often associated with the war. These conditions further meant that only a fraction of the German artillery batteries had been identified before the whistles blew. As a result, the storm of steel into which the French advanced proved to be almost as costly as July 1st, 1916 had been to the British. The Germans knew exactly what was coming, and they had prepared for the onslaught by retiring from their forward positions, lessening the effect of the French bombardment. The 5 million shells that plowed into their lines ultimately did more damage to the French than the Germans, churning the ground into a seething mass of mud and slime. When the infantry went over the top, their rolling barrage proved woefully inadequate, falling desperately short and immolating much of the advancing French forces before they even breached the enemy's lines. As the attack commenced, the Germans appeared from their deep sanctuaries, dazed but relatively unscathed, and began to strafe the French from the rear. It's estimated that the Germans had 100 machine guns for every kilometer of the battlefield. The French didn't stand a chance. At the end of that first day, the French had suffered over 40,000 casualties, but despite what had now become a forlorn hope, the attacks continued over the coming days. In a Herculean effort, the 69th Battalion of the Senegalese Infantry managed to reach the Hurtubise farm on the top of the Chemin des Dames ridge before it was finally annihilated, almost to a man. It was an intolerable defeat for an army that had registered few victories during the war. Robert Nivelle, Commander-in-Chief of the French Army, lost his command on May 15th, and the French were left in a state of abject despair. The famous Elan spirit of the poilu had been broken, battered, and left to die on the slopes of the Chemin des Dames.
These were men who had already been through the meat grinder of Verdun. They had already gone through the meat grinder of the Somme, because many French divisions were sent there as well. They had the catastrophic casualties in 1914, as I mentioned, where they lost 350,000 killed in the first 3 months. So they had lost about 1 million men dead up to the point of the Chemin des Dames offensive in April of 1917. They had been promised a lot with this offensive, just as they've been promised a lot with all the offensives previously. This one once again ended in disaster. They were promised to go 5 miles in the first day. They went 500 meters at the loss of 20,000 men.
Finally, after countless battles, the reservoir of moral courage had run dry, and on May 5th, the 21st Division mutinied.
The mutiny, or as it sometimes is also referred, collective and discipline action. And the reason why it's important to use, I think, a nuanced term is that it's not a mutiny as we traditionally conceive of it, when the men rise up against their officers, usually with force, violence, and put them down.
Of course, depending on the campaign, obviously the notorious Nivelle offensives of April 1917, the angst came out. They just could not deal with it anymore. They felt like they were really being sent into the slaughter all the time and totally lost faith. So, you saw the same thing happen in the Russian troops who were serving in the French army. Of course, they were affected by their own revolution, so they had problems. But I guess that's a big thing that sets the French soldiers apart, is that once they'd been sent into the slaughter too many times, they said something about it. People like to use the term mutiny. That's wrong. Mutiny means you attack your officers, you stop doing your job. Most of the French soldiers who stopped, it was collective and discipline. They weren't going to leave the front. They just weren't going to attack.
It wasn't just the slaughter on the field of battle that had broken the French. It was the daily grind, the attritional nature of an industrial war, and the feeling of being simply expendable in the eyes of the officers that led them, that had finally caused the dam to burst.
This is once again, it became a catalyst for the French troops. And the men in the rear, who were being told now that it was their turn to go back up to the front and be sacrificed, said they had had enough. They were citizen soldiers of a republic. They were citizens first. They saw the wastage in the general's tactics and planning. They thought, we want to win this war, and we can't win this war the way that you're waging it. So they refused to, first gradually squads and platoons, and then sometimes entire regiments, refused to advance to the front lines.
The French did not benefit from the British attitude toward rotation. Home leave was regularly canceled, and when men were moved out of the front lines, they were not properly rested before they were sent back in. Rations were appalling, and the faith in the command had evaporated. Nivelle, the hero of Verdun, had failed his men.
But there were certain grievances that they felt needed to be addressed. One of the biggest one being the wastage in lives. But they even also had complaints about the food. They had notoriously poor food in the French army. So one of their grievances was, we want food that actually has vitamins in it and that is nutritious and changes somewhat. We also want to establish a better system of leave. They're in their home country, and some men hadn't been home for a year, sometimes longer. Leave was always suspended before bigger offensives as well. So a number of sort of social, political grievances that had to be addressed. And once those were addressed, they went on fighting, because by the autumn of 1917, they're already launching successful limited offensives against the German lines.
Once the 21st Division had made their stand, the insurrection spread like wildfire through the lines. Mutinous acts were recorded in 68 divisions, 136 regiments, and 23 battalions. Soldiers began to desert at a frightening rate, and many of those that stayed refused to go back up the lines. They demonstrated openly and sang revolutionary songs, including the Internationale. Despite the failures of Nivelle on the whole, the French did adhere to his famous utterance at Verdun, "Ils ne passeront pas," they shall not pass.
It wasn't walking away from the front and throwing their guns down. If the Germans had attacked, they would have fought back, surely.
Any more pointless attacks were out of the question, but the lines were still defended. The enmity felt towards the High Command was indeed strong, but it was nothing compared to that directed at the hated invaders. In the end, it was General Pétain who finally ended the insurrection and brought order to the lines. He took command and immediately improved living conditions, the allocation of leave, and further rotation of troops in and out of the line.
Pétain's approach was actually the right approach, I think, for the time. He had a reputation in the army of being a man who could identify with the troops, and the troops felt that he understood them, much more so than some of the other generals. His role at the Battle of Verdun sealed that role, where he had obviously demonstrated sort of a fatherly, compassionate role for his men. And they brought him in to deal with the mutinies because they thought, rather than bring in someone who's going to be harsh, a disciplinarian, punish everybody, and then have the entire army really get into revolt, they said, we need to negotiate with these people. And that way, the mutiny was very much like a labor strike. So they brought in a mediator, and the mediator was Pétain. Pétain immediately went about meeting some of these grievances and settling some of them, including reestablishing the system of leave, improving pay, building rest stations along the railroads for when troops were debarked so they didn't have to sleep in the train cars, all these small things.
He also instigated a policy of focusing attacks on achievable objectives and ensured that artillery, aircraft, and tanks properly supported the infantry's assaults.
And then on a more strategic level, he ended up saying to himself, okay, well listen, if the attack cannot succeed with a reasonable chance, and given the reasonable provisions and supplies and material and men, then we're not going to launch it. They're not going to launch an attack. So he brought in overwhelming firepower, planned everything down to the T, made sure the men had adequate knowledge of the ground they were going to be covering, made sure they were adequately supplied in weaponry, that the artillery was able to move forward in time to meet the advance of the troops. And by just making some of these more simple adjustments, he had 3 successful offensives, and I think that helped to restore the morale of the men, combined with the changes he made on their non-active side, I guess I should say.
The Germans never grasped what was occurring only a few meters from their positions. If they had, then the outcome of the war might have been very different. Quite why the Germans didn't pick up on the mutiny is difficult to assess, but partially it must be attributed to their attentions being focused on the Ypres salient and the British attack at Passchendaele. Even so, the discontent in the French ranks was no minor event. Between April 1917 and January 1918, as many as 40,000 men were involved in the uprising. As a result, 554 men were condemned to death by the French command. Many had been selected by drawing lots. Ultimately, only 26 were actually executed.
The men did not go unpunished. They actually sentenced a number to death. I don't quite recall the figure right now. It was several hundred. Most of them had their sentences suspended to life imprisonment or hard labor, and a number were also executed. And he felt that it was important in the most egregious of cases to make an example out of those who had taken this act. And I think the men who did it understood what was at stake as well. So there were sacrifices that had to be made for, I would say, a greater cause for their comrades.
The main French victory in the war, albeit a Pyrrhic one, had been at Verdun. As a result, Pétain was held in high regard by the poilus, and his efforts to control the line and improve conditions proved to be invaluable. Within a few months of the insurrection being brought under control, the Germans launched their Kaiserschlacht offensive, which tore through the Allied lines at a ferocious rate. But by then, a man whom many regarded to be one of France's greatest soldiers had reinvigorated his armies, enabling them to soak up the German onslaught. Mutiny in the ranks could have happened to any of the armies that occupied the ruined earth of the Western Front, but the fact that it was the French who rebelled is not a complete surprise. Nevertheless, it was certainly not cowardice that shattered their attacking will. The French losses during the war were truly horrendous, with their dead, wounded, and missing totaling almost 6 million men, about double the figure for the British and more than that of the Germans. But more importantly, The mutiny was the result of men being pushed beyond the limit of what they could endure. Their collective courage had been slowly eroded away by the attritional nature of a war from which there could only be one winner. The conflict may have been a war between nations, but in reality, it was also a titanic battle between man and his industrially manufactured killing weapons. And in a global conflict between flesh and material, it was always going to be man who cracked first.